Chapter 1. Whispers of Forever. Love, when it is real, does not arrive with a warning. It sweeps in like the tide, filling every hollow space, making the world feel fuller, more alive. That was how it had been for them, Max and her. She had always believed in the kind of love that poets wrote about, the kind that lived in stolen glances, fingertips brushing over skin, whispered promises beneath a canopy of stars. And for 4 years, she had lived that love. She had drowned in it, reveled in its warmth, and built an entire world around its existence. Max had been her world. They met in the most unremarkable of places, a coffee shop that smelled of cinnamon and day-old pastries. She had been hunched over a book, oblivious to the hum of life around her, until a deep voice broke through the fog of words she had been lost in. "Excuse me, but I think you've been reading the same page for the past 5 minutes." She looked up, startled, and met the kind of gaze that made the air shift. Hazel eyes, mischievous and warm, a smirk that hovered between cocky and charming. He was the kind of man who made the world tilt slightly off its axis, the kind that pulled you in before you even realized you had moved closer. She should have been annoyed, but instead, she had laughed. That was how it had started. Love, for them, had been effortless in the beginning. It had been late-night drives with the windows down, music humming between them like a second heartbeat. It had been shared milkshakes, stolen kisses in the rain, whispered conversations at 2 a.m. when the rest of the world was asleep. It had been the small things, the way he tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, the way his thumb traced lazy circles on her wrist when he held her hand. She had never believed in soulmates, but if they existed, Max had to be hers. He understood her in a way no one else ever had. He knew her favorite kind of flowers weren't roses but wild daisies, the kind that grew on the sides of forgotten roads. He knew she hated the sound of ticking clocks because it reminded her of how quickly time slipped through her fingers. He knew that when she loved, she did so with every fragile, unguarded part of her heart. And he had loved her in return, or at least that was what she had thought. Their love had been a fire, burning bright and all-consuming. But even the most beautiful flames had a way of turning into ash. For now, though, there were no storm clouds in sight, no whispered betrayals lurking in the corners of their love. There was only them, young and reckless in the way only people madly in love could be. On the night of their 4-year anniversary, he took her to the cliffs just outside the city. It was their place, their secret escape from the rest of the world. The wind was sharp against her skin, but she barely noticed. Max stood behind her, arms wrapped around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. "Do you ever think about forever?" he asked, his voice soft against the curve of her neck. She smiled, leaning into him. "All the time." He turned her around then, cupping her face in his hands, his gaze tracing every inch of her as if trying to memorize her. "Then let's promise each other something." Her breath hitched. "What kind of promise?" "No matter where life takes us, no matter what happens, we don't forget this. We don't forget us." She searched his eyes, her heart swelling with something so achingly tender it almost hurt. "I promise." And just like that, with the ocean roaring beneath them and the stars as their only witnesses, they sealed their fate. She did not know then that love, even when it feels indestructible, is as fragile as a butterfly's wings. One wrong touch, one misstep, and it shatters. But on that night, in that moment, she believed in forever. And Max? He let her believe it too. Chapter 2. A love too bright to last. Love, in its most intoxicating form, has a way of blinding those who dare to embrace it fully. It makes the world feel infinite, as though nothing beyond the two souls entwined could possibly matter. That was the illusion she and Max had lived in, a world crafted by their own devotion, untouched by the inevitability of change. But even the brightest stars burn out, and even the strongest love can crumble under the weight of fate. Their days together were drenched in the golden light of happiness, an endless summer that never seemed to fade. Weekends were spent curled up in bed, tangled in sheets and whispers, promising each other lifetimes of love. They filled their hours with laughter and adventure, with long drives down forgotten roads and midnight swims beneath a moonlit sky. Max had a way of making the ordinary feel extraordinary. He would press a kiss to the inside of her wrist as if he were sealing a secret there, trace patterns along her spine when she lay beside him, and tell her that she was the only thing in this world that made him feel truly alive. She believed him. She believed him so fiercely that she ignored the tiny moments when his gaze lingered somewhere distant, as if he were searching for something beyond her. She dismissed the unease that settled in her chest when he'd pull away from a kiss just a second too soon, or when silence would stretch between them like an ocean neither of them wanted to acknowledge. Love, she told herself, was not perfect. It was not always easy. And yet, for 4 years, it had been enough. But love, real love, is never about just one person's willingness to fight for it. It requires two hearts beating in unison, two people willing to withstand the storms as much as they relish in the sunshine. The night everything changed was deceptively beautiful. The city hummed with life, and the air was thick with the scent of rain that had not yet fallen. They had spent the evening at a small, dimly lit restaurant, their hands intertwined over candlelight, their laughter soft and full of something that felt like forever. She had never loved Max more than she did in that moment, but forever had never been theirs to claim. It started with a phone call. His phone buzzed against the table, and for the briefest second, she saw hesitation flicker across his face. It was quick, so quick that if she had not known him so well, she would have missed it. He silenced the call without answering, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Who was that?" she asked lightly, not because she doubted him, but because she trusted him enough to ask. "No one," he said too quickly, reaching for his glass of wine. "Just a work thing. A lie. A small one, perhaps, but a lie nonetheless." She should have pressed him then. She should have looked closer, listened harder, understood what his eyes were trying to say. But she didn't. Instead, she let the conversation drift elsewhere, allowed herself to believe that they were still standing on solid ground. That was her mistake. That night, as she lay beside him, wrapped in the warmth of his embrace, she should have felt safe. Instead, she felt the first whisper of something breaking, and in the days that followed, that whisper would turn into a scream. Chapter 3. The cracks beneath the surface. The thing about love is that it does not shatter all at once. It fractures and whispers, in the space between unsaid words, in the hesitations that go unnoticed until it is too late to mend what is broken. She had always believed that love, once given so completely, could not simply fade away. But as the days passed after that phone call, she began to see the cracks forming beneath the surface of their once unshakable world. Max was still there, still smiling, still holding her hand, still pressing kisses against her temple when he thought she needed reassurance. But something had shifted. His touches were slower, like a man memorizing something he feared losing. His laughter was quieter, his mind always just out of reach. It was in the way his eyes darted away too quickly when she searched them for answers, in the way his hands felt heavier when they held hers, as if weighted by a secret he could not bring himself to share. She tried to ignore it, tried to push away the gnawing feeling of unease every time his phone buzzed at odd hours, every time his lips curved into a forced smile when she asked about his day. She told herself that love was not always easy, that maybe he was just tired, that maybe she was reading too much into things. After all, 4 years had made them stronger than this, hadn't it? But doubt, once planted, grows like ivy, creeping into every unguarded moment, wrapping itself around memories that once felt unbreakable. One evening, she came home to find him sitting on the couch, his shoulders slumped, his fingers rubbing slow circles against his temples. He did not look up when she walked in. The air in the room was thick with the weight of something unspoken. "Max?" she called softly, setting her keys on the table. He looked up then, and for a moment, she saw the man she had fallen in love with, the man who had once made her feel as if the entire world existed only for them. But the moment passed too quickly. His smile was there, but his eyes betrayed him. "Hey," he said, his voice a little too light, a little too forced. "Long day?" She nodded, sitting beside him. Silence stretched between them, and for the first time, she did not know how to fill it. "Max," she murmured, reaching for his hand. He let her take it, but his fingers did not tighten around hers the way they used to. "Is something wrong?" For a second, she thought she saw something flicker across his face, a battle between truth and deceit. But then, he shook his head, pressing a kiss to the back of her hand. "Nothing's wrong," he promised. "I love you. You know that?" And because she wanted so badly to believe him, she nodded. "I love you too. But love, no matter how deep, cannot erase the feeling that something was already slipping away. And she was starting to fear that by the time she figured out what it was, it would be too late to stop it. Chapter 4. A Kiss Stolen by Fate. Love, once so steady and unshaken, had begun to feel like a dream she could not quite hold on to. It was still there in whispers, in echoes of laughter, in the way Max would brush his fingers over her cheek when he thought she was sleeping. But something beneath the surface had shifted, a rift so quiet yet so profound that she felt its presence in the stillness of the night, in the way her heart clenched when he turned away just a little too soon. It was the little things that betrayed him first, the lingering scent of perfume that was not hers clinging to his shirts, the way his phone was always face down, a barrier between her and whatever truth lay within its screen, the distant look in his eyes, as though he were here and yet not. She told herself she was imagining things, that love like theirs did not simply unravel overnight, that 4 years of devotion and whispered promises were not so fragile. But doubt is a slow poison, creeping into the mind in quiet moments of solitude, twisting memories into questions, turning certainty into fear. One evening, as autumn cast its golden hues across the city, she decided she needed to know. Not through guesses, not through quiet suffering, but through the truth, no matter how much it might wound her. Max had come home late, his smile warm but distant. He kissed her temple, a habit so natural that it almost convinced her nothing had changed. "Almost. You're late," she said softly, trying to keep the tremor from her voice. "Work ran over," he replied, kicking off his shoes. "You know how it is." But she did not know. Not anymore. Work had always run over. Meetings had always stretched late. But before, there had never been the smell of unfamiliar perfume. Before, he had always come home eager to tell her about his day, to pull her close and fill their space with laughter. Now, there was only this strange, widening distance. Swallowing her fear, she stepped closer, her fingers grazing his wrist. "Max," she whispered, "is there something you want to tell me?" His body tensed, just for a fraction of a second, so small a moment that she could have convinced herself she imagined it. But she knew better now. She had spent years memorizing him, learning every sigh, every flicker of emotion in his eyes. And for the first time, she saw hesitation. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice too light, too careful. She held his gaze, searching for something, anything, that could give her a reason to trust him again. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I feel like I'm losing you." His lips parted, as though he wanted to deny it, to reach for her the way he always had. But then, something changed. A shadow passed over his face, his eyes darkening with something unreadable, and instead of the truth, he offered a smile. A practiced, careful smile that no longer reached his eyes. "You're not losing me," he said. "You're imagining things." And maybe, for a moment, she wanted to believe him. But the heart, when broken, knows better than to accept lies dressed as comfort. She turned away then, her chest heavy with a truth she was not yet ready to face. Something was slipping between her fingers, and she had a feeling she would not be able to hold on to it much longer. Chapter 5. The night betrayal bloomed. The unraveling of a love story is never as loud as one might think. It does not explode in a single moment of devastation, but erodes piece by piece, in quiet exchanges and unanswered questions, in the spaces between what is spoken and what is held back. She awoke that morning with a hollow feeling in her chest. The sky outside their window was gray, the sun barely piercing through the thick clouds. It felt fitting, as though the world itself was mourning something she had yet to put into words. Max had left early. No note, no text, just an absence where he should have been. She tried to tell herself it didn't mean anything, that she was reading too much into the silence. But doubt had made a home in her heart, and it refused to be ignored. The hours dragged by, each one heavier than the last. She moved through the motions of her day: coffee, work, meaningless conversations with colleagues. But everything felt muted, like a world painted in grayscale. Then, in the early evening, her phone buzzed. "Max, I'll be home late. Don't wait up." For years together, and she had memorized the nuances of his words. And these, short, careful, distant, felt nothing like him. A part of her wanted to confront him, to demand an explanation. But another part, the part that feared the answer, kept her silent. Instead, she found herself scrolling through social media, searching for something, anything, that might fill in the blanks he refused to. And that was when she saw it. A photo. A simple, harmless photo. But it was enough to send her world crumbling. Max sitting at an intimate restaurant, his head tilted toward someone she knew far too well. Her half-sister, her breath caught in her throat. She stared at the image, her mind struggling to process what her heart already knew. The tilt of his smile, the way his hand rested too close to hers, it all told a story she had never wanted to read. Tears blurred her vision, and for a moment, she considered calling him, demanding answers. But what was there to say? She had spent months pretending she wasn't losing him, convincing herself that love, once so strong, could not betray her like this. But it had. Love had not just betrayed her. He had. The storm had been gathering for months, and now it had finally arrived. She sat there, staring at the screen, feeling as though the walls of her world had crumbled in an instant. Memories of their love came flooding back. His whispered promises, their late-night confessions, the way he had once looked at her as if she were his entire world. And yet, here he was, sitting with someone else, smiling in a way that no longer belonged to her. Numbness seeped into her bones as the weight of it all settled on her chest. How long had this been going on? How many nights had he come home to her with another woman's scent still lingering on his skin? How many times had he kissed her while his mind was elsewhere? She wanted to scream, to throw her phone across the room, to demand answers. But deep down, she already knew. The truth had been hiding in the spaces between them for months, in the way he held her less tightly, in the way he laughed less freely, in the way he always seemed one step away from walking out the door. And now, here it was, laid out in front of her in the form of a single photograph. Proof that her worst fears had been real all along. The betrayal stung like ice against her skin. This wasn't just any woman. It was her half-sister. The one person she had grown up learning to tolerate, to forgive, to coexist with despite the differences between them. And now, she had taken the one thing that had mattered most. She closed her eyes, willing herself to breathe. The pain was sharp, unbearable, but she would not break. Not now. Not yet. Her fingers trembled as she set the phone down. As she stood from the couch and wrapped her arms around herself in a feeble attempt to keep from falling apart. Tonight, she would not cry. Tonight, she would not beg for answers. Tonight, she would begin to let go of the love she thought would last forever. Chapter 6. Shattered in silence. Lena sat at the kitchen table, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup, her mind adrift in the currents of the past. The warm sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting soft beams of gold across the room. It was a quiet morning, a rare moment of peace in the whirlwind of her life. Her 5-year-old son, Ethan, was in the next room, drawing pictures of animals and trees with crayons scattered around him like confetti. The sound of his laughter, innocent and pure, tugged at her heart, a reminder of the life she had built, the life she had fought so hard to reclaim. She should have been happy. She had everything she needed: a loving husband, a son who adored her, and a stable, fulfilling life. Yet, despite all of that, there was a part of her, a small, persistent part, that couldn't let go of the past. The memories of Max, their time together, the love they had shared, it all lingered like a shadow in the corners of her mind. No matter how hard she tried to suppress it, the ghost of their relationship would always find a way to resurface. It had been years since they had last spoken, since the night she had walked away from him in search of her own peace. The betrayal had cut deep, deeper than she had ever imagined possible. The trust they had built had crumbled, leaving behind only ruins. Max's affair with her half-sister, a painful wound that had torn through their relationship, had shattered everything. The scars of that betrayal remained etched in her heart, but time, as it often does, had allowed those wounds to heal, if not completely, then enough to let her move forward. And yet, life had a way of throwing unexpected challenges at her. She had met Tom not long after she had left Max. Tom had been steady, reliable, a man who cared for her in ways that Max never had. He had shown her what it meant to be loved without condition, without the weight of secrets and lies. Tom had given her a sense of stability, something she had desperately needed in the aftermath of the wreckage Max had left behind. They had built a life together, one that was simple, but it was theirs. Ethan, their beautiful child, was the product of that life, a symbol of the love and commitment they had shared. But even with all the happiness she had found with Tom, the memories of Max still lingered, like a half-remembered dream that refused to fade away. The thought of him still brought a sharp ache to her chest, one she couldn't quite explain. She had moved on, hadn't she? She had to believe that she had, because to think otherwise would mean she had wasted years of her life on someone who hadn't deserved her. Her phone buzzed on the counter, pulling her from her thoughts. Lena glanced at it, expecting another reminder from Tom or perhaps a message from a friend. But when she saw the name on the screen, her heart skipped a beat. It was a number she didn't recognize, but there was something about it that made her stomach twist. "Hello," she answered, her voice shaky, betraying the calm she had tried to maintain. "Lena?" The voice on the other end was familiar, though it had been so long since she had heard it. It was Max, his tone both tentative and hesitant, as though he wasn't sure if he had the right to reach out to her after everything that had happened. "Max," she breathed, the name hanging in the air between them like a thread connecting the past to the present. How are you?" There was a long pause before he answered. "I've been better," he said, his voice thick with emotion. I just wanted to hear your voice. I know I don't deserve it, but I had to call." Lena closed her eyes, trying to steady herself. She hadn't expected this, not now, not after all this time. The years had passed, and yet, hearing his voice again, she was back there, in the pain, the heartbreak, the betrayal. "Why are you calling, Max?" she asked, her words soft but firm. "I don't know," he admitted. I needed to know if you were okay. If you were happy." The question hit her harder than she had anticipated. She wanted to say that she was, that she had moved on, that she had everything she needed. But the truth was more complicated than that. I'm fine," she said, the words tasting bitter on her tongue. "I have a family now. I'm happy with Tom and Ethan. I've moved on, Max. I have to." Max was silent for a moment, and Lena could almost hear the weight of his regret pressing down on him. "I never should have done what I did," he said quietly. "I never should have hurt you like that. I was selfish, and I'm so sorry, Lena. I can't undo the past, but I can tell you that I've never stopped loving you." Lena's heart wrenched at his words. She had spent so long trying to bury her feelings for him, trying to convince herself that she was better off without him. But hearing him say those words, hearing the vulnerability in his voice, made her question everything. "I don't know what you want from me, Max," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I can't just forget what happened. I can't pretend that everything is fine." "I don't expect you to forget," he replied. I just wanted to apologize. To let you know that I still care, even if it's too late." The silence between them stretched out, and for a moment, it felt as if time had stood still. Lena's mind raced, torn between the life she had now and the memories of a love she had once believed would last forever. Could she forgive him? Could she let go of the past and embrace the future with him? Or had the damage already been done? Before she could say anything more, Max spoke again, his voice tinged with finality. "I don't want to keep you from your life, Lena. I just needed to say that. I'll leave you alone now." The call ended, leaving Lena with a strange emptiness in her chest. She stared at the phone for a long time, the echo of Max's words lingering in her mind. She had moved on, hadn't she? So why did it feel as though a door had just been opened, one she had thought was closed forever? Lena walked over to the window, gazing out at the world beyond. The sun was still shining, the day still unfolding, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, something had changed. And in the distance, a butterfly fluttered by, its wings beating softly against the wind. Chapter 7. Echoes of a Love Lost. Lena spent the rest of the day in a haze, her mind spinning in a whirlwind of confusion and old memories. Max's call lingered in the back of her thoughts like an uninvited guest, one who refused to leave. She had told herself that she was over him, that the years had dulled the sharpness of the hurt, but now, after hearing his voice again, she wasn't so sure. Tom noticed something was off when he returned home later that evening. Lena had always been good at hiding her feelings, wearing a mask of composure that she had perfected over the years, but tonight, it was different. He could see it in her eyes, the faraway look, the subtle tension in her posture. She was somewhere else, lost in a world he couldn't reach. "Lena," Tom said gently, as he set his briefcase down by the door. "Is everything okay?" She turned to him, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Yeah, everything's fine," she replied, but there was a hollow quality to her voice that made Tom raise an eyebrow. He walked over to her, concern etched on his face. "You sure? You've been quiet all evening." Lena hesitated, her fingers nervously twisting a strand of her hair. She wanted to tell him, to explain the storm that was raging inside her, but she didn't know how. She didn't want to hurt him, especially not after everything they had built together. Tom had been there for her when she had been at her lowest, and she owed him the world. He deserved her full attention, her undivided love. But how could she give him that when part of her heart was still tethered to a past that seemed so distant, yet so painfully alive? "I'm just tired," she said after a long pause, offering a thin smile. "It's nothing, really." Tom didn't look convinced, but he let it go for the moment. "All right, if you say so. I'll make dinner, then we can relax." "Ethan's already in bed?" Lena nodded, grateful for the normalcy of the moment. "Yeah, he fell asleep on the couch watching cartoons." As Tom busied himself in the kitchen, Lena retreated to the living room, her mind still reeling from the conversation with Max. She sat on the couch, her hands clasped tightly together, as if holding herself together was the only thing she could control. The silence of the house was deafening, amplifying the thoughts swirling in her head. She tried to focus on Ethan's toys scattered across the floor, the soft, comforting sound of Tom humming in the kitchen, but it was no use. Her mind kept drifting back to that phone call. Why had Max called her? What did he want? The question haunted her, gnawing at her insides. She had convinced herself that the past was just that, the past. It was over, done with. She had a new life now, a life that was stable, loving, and fulfilling. But Max's words had cracked that facade open, exposing the vulnerability she had buried so deep within her. "I never stopped loving you." Those words echoed in her mind like a haunting refrain. She wanted to believe him, to believe that he had changed, that he truly regretted what he had done. But how could she? How could she trust him again after everything he had put her through? The betrayal had been so complete, so utterly devastating, that it felt like a wound that could never fully heal. Yet, there was a part of her that wondered what could have been if things had turned out differently. If Max had never made that mistake, if they had never been torn apart by lies and deceit, would they have still been together? Would they have built a life like the one she had with Tom? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the front door opening, followed by the familiar clatter of keys being dropped onto the table. Tom appeared in the doorway, carrying 2 plates of dinner. He smiled at her, his expression warm, but there was a glint of concern in his eyes. "Dinner's ready," he said, setting the plates down in front of her. "Come on, let's eat." Lena forced a smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. She nodded and followed him to the dining table, but even as she sat down, her mind was elsewhere, still caught in the web of the past. The dinner was quiet, filled only with the sounds of clinking silverware and the occasional murmur of conversation. Tom talked about his day at work, telling her about a new project he was excited about, but Lena could barely focus on his words. Every now and then, she would catch herself staring out the window, lost in thought. Max's voice was still ringing in her ears, and she couldn't shake the feeling that her life was on the verge of something she couldn't control. After dinner, Tom suggested they watch a movie together, but Lena declined, citing exhaustion. She retreated to their bedroom, hoping that a good night's sleep would help her make sense of everything that was swirling in her mind. But as she lay in bed, her eyes wide open, she realized that sleep would be elusive. The more she tried to quiet her thoughts, the louder they became. Max's call had unleashed something in her, something that she couldn't ignore. She closed her eyes, her fingers brushing the cool sheets beneath her, and for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to truly feel the weight of everything that had happened. The years of pain, of rebuilding, of moving forward. She had thought she was done with it, but now, the threads of the past were starting to unravel, slipping through her fingers, and she didn't know if she was strong enough to hold them together. Lena turned onto her side, her back to Tom, who was already asleep beside her. She could feel his warmth, his steady breathing, and a part of her wanted to reach out and hold on to him, to find comfort in the life they had created. But another part of her, the part that still carried the echoes of Max's love, felt like it was being pulled in 2 different directions. She didn't know what to do. She didn't know if she could keep pretending that everything was fine. The past was calling her, and whether she liked it or not, it was forcing her to confront it. The question was, could she let go of the past without losing herself in the process? Lena's thoughts swirled around her like a storm, and she couldn't escape it. There was no simple answer, no easy way forward. All she could do was face the uncertainty, take a deep breath, and try to navigate the maze of her heart, one step at a time. Chapter 8. Picking Up Broken Pieces. The days following Max's call blurred together, each one bleeding into the next like watercolor in a storm. Lena had told herself she would be fine, that the uncertainty would pass with time, but it didn't. It lingered, like a cloud that refused to dissipate. Her mornings were filled with the rhythmic routines of motherhood. Getting Ethan ready for school, preparing his lunch, hearing his small voice as he chattered about his day. But her mind, her heart, was elsewhere. The heaviness that had settled in her chest when she had heard Max's voice hadn't lifted. It only seemed to grow. Tom noticed the shift in her behavior almost immediately. He had always been perceptive, able to read the subtle changes in her mood with an uncanny accuracy. But for all his understanding, he was still missing something. The root of the tension that seemed to have taken hold of her. And Lena, for her part, wasn't sure how to explain it. How could she put into words what she didn't fully understand herself? One evening, after Ethan had gone to bed, Tom sat down next to Lena on the couch, his hand resting on hers. The television was on, but neither of them was watching it. They sat in silence for a few moments, the weight of unspoken words between them. "Lena," Tom began, his voice soft but steady. "I know something's been bothering you lately. You've been distant." Lena shifted, discomfort prickling at the edges of her skin. She couldn't meet his eyes. "I'm fine," she said, the words sounding hollow even to her. She had said it so many times, but it had never felt more untrue. Tom's gaze didn't waver. "You've said that before, but I know you better than that. If something's on your mind, you can talk to me." Lena swallowed hard, her throat tight. She had always prided herself on her ability to keep her emotions in check, to protect Tom from the cracks in her heart. But tonight, the floodgates seemed to be on the verge of breaking. She pulled her hand away from his, wrapping her arms around herself as if to keep from falling apart. "I don't know what's going on with me," she confessed, her voice small, almost fragile. "I keep thinking about Mac." The name hung in the air between them like a sudden chill. Tom's face tightened, his expression unreadable, but Lena could feel the shift in him. She had never fully told him about Max, not in detail. She had mentioned him in passing, spoken of the past in vague terms, but she had never truly opened up about the depth of what had happened. "You're still thinking about him?" Tom asked, his voice steady but carrying an edge of something Lena couldn't quite place. Was it hurt? Was it jealousy? Lena nodded, her eyes downcast. "I don't want to, but I can't help it. He called me a few days ago." She let the words hang there, unsure of how to explain the aftermath. Tom didn't speak immediately. He simply stared at her, his jaw clenched. Lena could see the internal struggle in his eyes, the battle between his love for her and the deep insecurity that had always lingered beneath the surface. He had never been able to shake the fear that Lena's past with Max was a shadow that could never be erased. "Why would he call you now?" Tom's voice was tight, his question more about his own confusion than hers. "What does he want?" Lena shook her head, frustration bubbling inside her. "I don't know. He said he just wanted to apologize. He wanted to know if I was okay." Her voice faltered. "And I don't know why, but I believed him. I don't know why I care, Tom. I'm not supposed to." Tom exhaled sharply, his hand running through his hair. "Lena, you've moved on. You have a life with me now. We have a son together. Max doesn't get to just waltz back in and reopen old wounds." "I know," Lena whispered, tears welling in her eyes. I don't want to feel this way. But hearing him again, it just brought everything back. The good, the bad, everything. Tom turned toward her, his face softening, but the tension was still there. You're mine now, he said, his voice quiet but firm. You don't owe him anything. You don't owe him your heart or your thoughts or your time. What we have, what we've built, is real. And it's more than what you had with him. Lena's breath caught in her throat. She had always known that Tom loved her. She had always known that he was devoted to their family, to their life. But in that moment, she realized how much her emotional distance had affected him. She hadn't meant to pull away, to create space between them. She had simply been trying to keep the chaos of her heart contained, to protect him from the storm that had stirred inside her. I know, she said softly, wiping away a tear that had slipped down her cheek. I do love you, Tom. I don't want to hurt you, but I don't know how to stop thinking about Max. I don't know how to let it go. Tom reached out and took her hand, his grip gentle but firm. You don't have to figure it all out right now, but you can't keep carrying the past around like it's a weight on your shoulders. You have to choose, Lena. You have to decide where your heart belongs, because I can't keep fighting for you if you're still holding on to him. Lena closed her eyes, the tears falling freely now. She didn't know what to say. The truth was, she didn't know what her heart wanted anymore. It had been so long since she had truly let herself feel anything, since she had allowed herself to be vulnerable in a way that wasn't tied to the pain of betrayal. Tom had given her everything, but Max had been her first love, the one who had shattered her in ways she couldn't even explain. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice breaking. I don't want to hurt you. I don't want to lose you. You're not going to lose me, Tom said, his voice softening. But you need to be honest with yourself, Lena, about what you want, about what we've built. I'm here, but I can't fight for both of us. Lena nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle deep within her. She knew he was right. She couldn't keep living in the space between the past and the present. Something had to give. But she wasn't ready to make that choice yet. Not tonight. The room felt heavy, the silence between them stretching out like an endless chasm. Lena didn't have the answers. She didn't even know where to begin. But one thing was certain. Whatever path she chose, the echo of the past would never be far behind. And as she lay in bed that night, curled into Tom's arms, the quiet hum of their breathing filling the room, she couldn't help but wonder if the cracks that had begun to form in their relationship would ever be mended, or if, in time, they would widen into irreparable fractures. Chapter 9. The Man Who Loved Me Next. The morning after her conversation with Tom felt like a turning point, though Lena wasn't sure if it was a step forward or a deeper descent into uncertainty. The weight of Tom's words echoed in her mind, relentless and sharp. You have to choose, Lena. He had said that with such quiet finality, and yet, the very idea of making that decision seemed impossible. How could she choose between the life she had built, the man who had been everything to her, and the ghost of a love that had never quite died? Lena moved through the motions of the day mechanically, her mind far removed from the kitchen counter where she was preparing breakfast, far removed from the warm, sleepy smile Ethan greeted her with as he entered the room. She had learned, over the years, to wear her mask well, and today was no different. Tom had left early for work, his lips pressing gently against her cheek before he walked out the door. He hadn't said much more than what had already been spoken the night before. He had given her space, but she knew, in his silence, that something had shifted between them. He had been patient with her, understanding even, but she could feel the distance growing. It wasn't something that could be easily ignored. He needed her to make a choice, and Lena could feel the walls around them starting to rise. Ethan was unusually quiet as well, his small hands picking at his cereal without much enthusiasm. He wasn't used to seeing his parents out of sync like this. The tension in the house was palpable, even for a child so young. Lena tried to shake off the unease, forcing herself to focus on Ethan, to remind herself that her son needed her, needed both of them, to be present, to be whole. But even as she smiled at him, the smile felt fake, plastered on with the kind of effort that made her stomach twist. After dropping Ethan off at school, Lena decided to take a walk. She needed space to breathe, to think, to clear her mind. It was a crisp autumn day, the air still carrying the remnants of summer's warmth, but tinged with the bite of the changing season. The leaves were turning, painting the streets in shades of red and gold, the vibrant colors stark against the gray skies overhead. It felt as though the world around her was shifting in the same way her own life was, slowly, inevitably, but with no clear destination in sight. She walked aimlessly, her feet carrying her down familiar streets, past the coffee shop she used to frequent with Max, past the park where they had spent countless summer afternoons. She had avoided these places for years, too painful to revisit, too full of memories that threatened to swallow her whole. But today, she couldn't help herself. Today, the memories felt like ghosts, silent but ever-present, and she found herself drawn back into their grasp. Max had been a part of every milestone in her life. The first kiss, the first heartbreak, the first time she thought she might lose herself in someone else. He had been there, through it all. And then, when it had all come crashing down, he had been the one to leave, leaving her behind to pick up the pieces. And now, here she was, with a family, with a man who loved her, and still, the shadow of Max lingered. She didn't know how much longer she could keep pretending that it didn't matter. The past had a way of creeping back in, despite her best efforts to shut it out. She thought about Tom, about everything he had given her, about the stability he had provided. He loved her, truly loved her. He was the kind of man who stood by your side, who weathered the storms with you. He was everything she had wanted in the aftermath of Max, everything that Max had failed to be. But then, Max had called, and suddenly, everything she thought she knew about herself, about her life, felt uncertain. His voice had brought everything back to the surface, raw, unhealed wounds that she had spent years trying to bury. Lena stopped at a bench in the park and sat down, pulling her coat tighter around her as the wind picked up. Her thoughts were a whirlwind, a storm of emotions and regrets. She had loved Max. She had loved him with a ferocity that had nearly consumed her. But that love had been twisted by betrayal, shattered by his actions, and now, all these years later, she was left trying to piece together what remained of it. The sound of a child laughing nearby brought her back to the present. She looked over and saw a mother playing with her young daughter in the grass. The sight of them, so carefree, so full of joy, made Lena's heart ache. She had once had that with Max, those moments of pure happiness, of being lost in each other. But now, all she had were memories that were tangled in pain. She stood up, suddenly feeling the weight of the moment. There was no escaping it. She couldn't keep running from the past, but she also couldn't keep ignoring the present. She had a life with Tom, a son, a family. She had everything she had ever wanted, but a part of her was still tethered to the past, to the love she had lost. As Lena walked back toward home, she knew she couldn't keep living in this limbo. She had to make a decision. She had to choose. But how could she choose when her heart was torn between two lives, two versions of herself? How could she choose when part of her still loved Max, despite everything he had done? When Lena arrived home, Tom was already there, sitting at the kitchen table, his work bag resting beside him. He looked up as she entered, his expression a mix of concern and resignation. He didn't say anything at first, but she could feel the weight of his gaze, the silent question hanging between them. "I went for a walk," Lena said softly, her her voice uncertain. "I needed to clear my head." Tom nodded, but his eyes didn't leave hers. "And?" Lena swallowed, taking a deep breath. She had thought about it all afternoon, and now, standing before him, the choice seemed both clearer and more impossible than ever. "I don't know what to do, Tom," she said, her voice shaking. "I don't know if I can let go of the past." Tom stood up and walked over to her, taking her hands in his. His touch was warm, grounding. "I'm not asking you to forget, Lena. I'm asking you to choose us. I'm asking you to choose me, to choose this life we've built. We can't keep living in the past." Lena closed her eyes, a tear slipping down her cheek. She didn't want to hurt him. She didn't want to lose him. But the truth was, she wasn't sure she could let go of Max. Not completely. Not when the love they had shared still lingered in the corners of her heart. "I don't know if I can," she whispered. Tom squeezed her hands gently, his voice low and steady. "Then we're at a crossroads, Lena, and I can't walk this road with you if you're still looking back." Lena felt her heart break all over again. She had to make a choice. She couldn't keep living with one foot in the past and the other in the present. But the question remained, which life would she choose? And what would happen to the part of her that still loved Max? Chapter 10. A Love Meant to Heal. The days that followed Lena's conversation with Tom felt like a slow descent into a place she couldn't quite name. The tension between them had settled into an uneasy truce, neither one of them speaking of the elephant in the room, but both aware of its presence. Tom was patient, perhaps too patient, as if waiting for her to make some sort of decision, some definitive movement that would bring them back to solid ground. And yet, every time Lena thought about it, she felt a quiet panic rise in her chest. What if she couldn't make a choice? What if the fracture between her heart and mind was too deep to mend? She had always been so certain of herself, of her love for Tom, of the life they had built together. And yet, the remnants of her past with Max, the sweetness of it, the pain of it, the way it had shaped who she was, refused to loosen its grip on her heart. She didn't know if it was because she had never fully healed from that love, or if it was something deeper, something about Max himself, about the way he had once made her feel seen in ways no one else had. The mornings were the hardest. She had always loved the simplicity of her routine. Getting Ethan ready for school, packing his lunch, hearing his laughter fill the house. But now, even the familiar motions seemed distant. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was pretending to be the woman she had been before everything had shifted, pretending that it was all okay when, in truth, her heart was a battlefield, torn between the love of the past and the present. One afternoon, as Lena sat at the kitchen table, her thoughts swirling in a haze of confusion, the doorbell rang. She looked up, startled, and glanced at the clock. Tom wasn't due home yet, and she hadn't been expecting anyone. She stood up slowly, her heart racing in her chest for reasons she couldn't explain, and walked to the door. When she opened it, she was met with a face that, for all its familiarity, still made her stomach drop. Max. He stood there, tall and commanding as always, his hands shoved into the pockets of his jacket, his expression unreadable. The sight of him hit Lena like a punch to the gut. She hadn't seen him in years, not since that day, the day everything had shattered. But here he was, standing on her doorstep like nothing had changed. "Lena," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of all the unspoken words between them. Lena's heart fluttered in her chest, a rush of conflicting emotions swirling within her. Her mind screamed at her to close the door, to protect the life she had built, to push him away and never look back. But her body didn't listen. She stood frozen, her hands still on the doorknob, her eyes locked with his. "What are you doing here, Max?" Her voice was soft, almost trembling. She hated that she still couldn't control the way he made her feel, The way his presence seemed to disrupt everything. I need to talk to you, he said, his voice laced with hesitation. Can I come in? Lena's breath caught in her throat. This was the moment, the one she had both feared and somehow longed for. The moment where the past collided with the present, where she had to decide if she was going to let it all in, or shut it out once and for all. She took a step back, unable to speak at first, her mind racing as she processed the implications of his sudden reappearance. But something inside her, something deep within her, urged her to let him in. She wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the unresolved questions that had lingered all these years, the ones that had never found answers. Or maybe it was the hope that, somehow, seeing him again would bring clarity. Come in, she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Max stepped inside, his presence as overwhelming as it had always been. Lena closed the door behind him, her fingers trembling as she locked it. The silence between them stretched out, thick and heavy, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Max stood by the door for a moment, his eyes scanning the familiar surroundings of her home. It felt like a lifetime ago that they had been here together, sharing the small moments that had once felt so precious. Lena didn't know what to say. She wanted to ask why he was here, what he wanted, but the questions seemed too sharp, too loaded. Instead, she walked over to the kitchen table and sat down, gesturing for him to do the same. Max hesitated before sitting across from her. He looked different, older in a way that was both subtle and obvious, but there was still that same intensity in his gaze. The same way he seemed to look right through her, as if he could see the parts of her that no one else could. I didn't want to do this over the phone, he said, his voice low. I needed to see you, to talk to you in person. Lena nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know if she was ready for this, didn't know if she ever would be. But she had been living with the weight of unanswered questions for too long. Maybe it was time to face them. Okay, she said quietly. What is it, Max? He took a deep breath, his eyes meeting hers with a mixture of regret and something else. Something deeper, something that made Lena's heart ache despite herself. I'm sorry, Lena, he said, his voice breaking slightly. For everything. For what I did to you. I know I can't take it back, but I need you to know that I regret it. I've regretted it every day since. Lena swallowed hard, her throat tight. She had been prepared for this, hadn't she? After all the years, the silence, the distance, she had imagined this moment 1,000 times. But hearing it from his lips, hearing the rawness in his voice, made everything feel so much more real and so much more painful. I don't know what to say, Lena whispered, her eyes brimming with tears. You broke me, Max. You shattered everything we had. Max's face twisted with anguish, his hands gripping the edge of the table. I know I did. And I wish there was a way to make it right, but I don't know how. All I know is that I'm sorry, Lena. I'm so sorry. Lena felt the tears slip down her cheeks, but she didn't wipe them away. She had spent so many years burying this pain, suppressing it, pretending it wasn't there. But now, sitting here with Max, it was impossible to ignore. It was as though the dam had broken, and all the hurt, all the unanswered questions were flooding to the surface. Max reached across the table, his hand hovering just above hers. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even expect you to want me in your life anymore. But I had to tell you this. I couldn't live with myself without you knowing. Lena looked at him, her heart torn in two. She could feel the weight of the past, the gravity of everything they had once shared, pulling her back toward him. But there was another part of her, the part that had spent so many years rebuilding her life with Tom, that knew this wasn't just about forgiveness. This was about something deeper, something more complicated. And it wasn't just about Max anymore. I don't know what to do with all of this, she said, her voice a whisper. as though the very words she spoke might break everything. Max nodded slowly, understanding, as if he had expected nothing more. "I don't expect you to have all the answers, Lena. I just needed you to know. And I needed you to know that I'll always love you, no matter what." Lena closed her eyes, feeling the weight of his words settle into her chest. She didn't know how to navigate this, didn't know what it meant for her future, for her life with Tom. But one thing was certain. Max's return had forced her to confront everything she had buried, and now she had to find a way to move forward, with or without him. Chapter 11. Ghosts in the Rain. The air felt thicker than usual in the days after Max's visit, and Lena couldn't quite escape the feeling that everything had changed. The conversation they'd shared was still replaying in her mind, over and over again. Max's words, his apology, his regret, had cut through her like a knife, reopening wounds she had thought had long since healed. But as painful as it was to hear, there was something undeniable about the rawness of his emotions. He hadn't come here to ask for forgiveness. He hadn't come here to disrupt her life. He had come to confess, to share a truth that had haunted him for years. But the problem was, Lena didn't know what to do with it. She didn't know what to do with him, or with her feelings. She had spent years rebuilding, creating a life with Tom, one that was stable, secure, and filled with love. And yet, here she was, once again caught between the past and the present, between the man who had once held her heart and the man who had been her anchor through the storm. Max's return had brought everything into sharp focus, but it also made the world feel blurry. She had spent so long trying to convince herself that the past was just that, the past. But now, with Max standing before her once more, she wasn't so sure. He still held a place in her heart, a part of her that she couldn't quite let go of, no matter how hard she tried. Lena had always prided herself on being strong, on being the kind of person who could handle whatever life threw her way. But this was different. This was a crossroads she hadn't anticipated, and every step she took seemed to lead her deeper into a maze of conflicting emotions, with no clear way out. Tom noticed the change in her, of course. He always did. He was perceptive, perhaps even too perceptive at times. She couldn't hide it from him. Not the way her smile didn't quite reach her eyes, or the way her thoughts seemed to wander even when she was right beside him. They still talked, still shared the small, everyday moments, but there was an underlying tension between them now, an unspoken understanding that things were not as they had been. It wasn't that Lena didn't love Tom. She did, more than she had ever thought possible. But in the wake of Max's reappearance, she found herself questioning everything. Was her love for Tom strong enough to weather this storm? Was it strong enough to overcome the ghosts of her past? And more importantly, did she still love Max in the way she once had? Or was that just a memory she had held onto out of habit? She could feel the weight of the decision pressing on her, a burden that seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. How could she choose between the man who had loved her so fiercely, who had been there through every trial, and the man who had once been her everything, her soulmate, only to shatter her heart into pieces? It was a question that haunted her, that invaded every moment of her day. She couldn't escape it, no matter how hard she tried. One afternoon, as Lena sat in the quiet of her living room, staring out the window at the soft golden light that filtered through the trees, the phone rang. She looked at the caller ID, her heart skipping a beat when she saw Tom's name flash across the screen. They hadn't spoken much today. He had been busy with work, and she had been lost in her own thoughts. She hesitated for a moment before answering, her pulse quickening. There was something in the pit of her stomach that told her this phone call would change things, that it would either push her further into the abyss of uncertainty or pull her back towards something solid, something real. "Hey," she said, her voice shaky, betraying the anxiety she felt. "Hey." Tom's voice was warm, familiar, But there was an edge to it, a slight tension that made Lena's chest tighten. I was thinking about what we talked about last week, about the choice you have to make. Lena closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. Tom, I know it's not easy, he interrupted softly, but I need you to know that whatever you decide, I'll support you. I've always wanted what's best for you, Lena. And if that means stepping aside, if that means letting you go. Lena's heart clenched. She hadn't expected him to say that, hadn't expected him to offer her that kind of space. She knew, deep down, that Tom loved her in a way that was selfless, unconditional. But the thought of losing him, of letting him go, made her feel as though she was losing a part of herself. Tom, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what to do. I don't know if I can choose. I understand, he replied gently. I don't want to force you into a decision, but I also don't want to hold you back. I want you to be happy, Lena, whatever that looks like. If I'm part of that, great. But if I'm not, I'll find a way to accept it. You deserve to be happy, whether it's with me or not. Lena's throat tightened, and she felt the tears rise unbidden, threatening to spill over. How had everything gotten so complicated? How had she ended up here, at this point where the very idea of happiness seemed like a distant memory? I need time, she said softly, the words coming out before she could stop them. I just need time to think. I'll give you all the time you need, Tom said. I love you, Lena. I just want what's best for you. And with that, he hung up. Lena sat there in the silence that followed, her heart in turmoil. She didn't know what was best for her. She didn't know if she could let Max go, if she could stop loving him, if she could fully commit to Tom. And yet, she didn't want to lose either of them. The choices before her felt impossible, as if every decision would lead to the destruction of something. Either the life she had built with Tom, or the part of her that still loved Max. Lena stood up, pacing the room as the weight of it all pressed in on her chest. She needed to make a choice. But how could she when her heart seemed to be pulling her in two different directions? How could she move forward when the past was so firmly rooted in her soul? Max's words echoed in her mind. I'll always love you, no matter what. And Tom's words, whatever you decide, I'll support you. She wished she could say the same. She wished she could tell them both that she knew what she wanted, that she could make a decision and move forward without looking back. But the truth was, she was stuck. Stuck between two loves, two lives, two futures. The choices felt too heavy to bear. Chapter 12. Colliding Paths, Colliding Hearts. Lena stood at the kitchen counter, stirring the pot of soup in front of her, but her mind was far from the simmering vegetables and broth. Her thoughts were consumed by the conversation she'd had with Tom. It had been a week since he'd made that heartfelt offer, since he'd told her that he would support her no matter what. He'd given her time, something that felt like both a gift and a curse. Time to think, time to choose. But the more time she had, the more she realized how impossible that decision was. She glanced out the window, watching the sunlight fade into the evening. It had been a few days since Max's visit, and even now, her chest ached with the weight of it. The conversation with him hadn't ended with any clear resolution, but something about his presence had shaken her. The questions that had once been buried deep inside her had resurfaced, and now they swirled in her mind like a storm she couldn't control. What if she was making a mistake? What if, by holding on to the past, she was letting go of something real, something she had worked so hard to build? She thought of Ethan, her son, the center of her world, and of Tom, who had been a steady presence in their lives for so long. How could she possibly jeopardize that for a man who had hurt her so deeply? But then she thought of Max, the man who had once been her everything, her world, the man who had left a permanent mark on her heart, one that even years apart couldn't erase. Could she really walk away from him forever? Was it fair to deny the part of her that still loved him, even if it was only a ghost of the past? Her heart felt torn in two, each side pulling her in opposite directions. The familiar ache of longing for Max was still there, despite everything that had happened. And yet, Tom had given her something Max never had: stability, understanding, and a love that had never faltered. Even when the road had been rocky, he had stayed. He had been there when she needed him, when she thought she would drown in the waves of grief and uncertainty. He had been her anchor. She sighed, setting the spoon down and wiping her hands on the dish towel. The sound of Ethan's laughter carried through the house, pulling her out of her thoughts. She turned toward the living room, where she saw him playing with his toy cars on the floor. His bright, innocent smile was enough to make her heart swell, but it also made the weight of her decision feel even heavier. What kind of future could she give him if she didn't make the right choice? Could she truly build a life with Tom, knowing that a part of her heart was still with Max? Could she live with herself if she chose Max over everything she had now? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the doorbell ringing. Lena hesitated, a wave of unease washing over her. She wasn't expecting anyone. Slowly, she wiped her hands on the towel again before walking to the door, her heart racing for reasons she couldn't quite explain. When she opened the door, she was surprised to find a delivery man standing in front of her with a bouquet of flowers in his hands. She blinked, taken aback. She hadn't received flowers in years, not since Max had left. "These are for you," the man said, offering the bouquet with a smile. "From who?" Lena asked, confused, though a flutter of hope rose in her chest. "Doesn't say." The man replied with a shrug. "It's just your name on the order." Lena took the flowers from him, her fingers brushing the cool, damp stems as she brought them inside. The scent of fresh roses and lavender filled the air, and for a brief moment, it felt like the world around her had paused. She set the bouquet on the kitchen counter and unwrapped the card that had been tucked beneath the flowers. Her breath caught as she read the words written in Max's unmistakable handwriting. "I never meant to hurt you. I can't change the past, but I'll always love you. Always. Mac." The words hit her like a wave, sweeping over her in a rush of emotions. She closed her eyes for a moment, taking in the weight of what they meant. Max had always been a man of few words, but when he spoke from the heart, it was impossible to ignore. And now, in the midst of everything, he was still reaching out to her. Lena felt her chest tighten, the old ache stirring once more. She stared at the card for what felt like an eternity, as if it held the answers she had been searching for. But the more she read it, the more she realized that it didn't. It didn't offer a solution. It didn't tell her what to do. It simply reminded her of the love they had once shared, and how it still lingered, even after all these years. She placed the card down on the counter, feeling the weight of the decision bearing down on her again. The room felt suddenly too small, too confined, as though there was no escape from the questions and the choices she had to make. She needed to breathe. Lena stepped outside, the evening air cool against her skin. She walked down the porch steps, taking in the quiet of the neighborhood. The world around her felt distant, as though she were suspended in time, caught between two versions of her life that no longer seemed to fit together. A breeze picked up, rustling the leaves of the trees, and for a brief moment, she closed her eyes, letting the wind carry away the chaos in her mind. She had always found comfort in nature, in the simplicity of the world around her. But tonight, even the stars seemed out of reach. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, breaking her reverie. She pulled it out, and her heart skipped a beat when she saw the name on the screen, Tom. She hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hello?" "Lena." Tom's voice came through the phone, warm and steady, but there was an edge to it now. "I know I've given you space, and I want to respect that, but I need to talk to you." To tell you what I've been thinking." Lena swallowed hard, her pulse quickening. She couldn't ignore the sense of urgency in his voice, the quiet desperation that had crept into his words. But she wasn't sure she was ready to face it. She wasn't sure she was ready to hear what he had to say, not when her heart was still so raw, not when she was still haunted by Max's unexpected reappearance. "Tom, I don't know if I can," she said softly, her voice trembling. "I need you to listen," Tom pressed gently, "because no matter what happens, I want you to know that I'm here. And I'll always be here. But I can't keep waiting, Lena. Not if you're not ready to make a decision." Lena felt the weight of his words like a physical blow. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. She knew this moment had to come. She knew it was time to face the reality of her situation, to stop running from the choices she had been avoiding. "I'll be home in an hour," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "We need to talk." She hung up the phone, standing there in the cool evening air for a few more moments before heading back inside. The storm was coming, and this time, she wouldn't be able to avoid it. Chapter 13. A Fire That Never Died. Lena couldn't shake the sense of dread that settled over her as she made her way home. The night air felt heavy, like it was pressing in from all sides. She could hear the rhythmic click of her shoes on the sidewalk, a stark contrast to the whirlwind inside her mind. She was trying to prepare herself for the conversation with Tom, trying to find the right words to explain the tangled mess of emotions she was feeling. But every time she thought she had a handle on things, something, some small moment, some memory, would slip through her fingers, leaving her grasping at air. When she stepped through the front door, the familiar scent of home greeted her. Warmth, comfort, the faintest hint of cinnamon from the candle she'd lit earlier that day. But tonight, it felt hollow, empty. Her eyes scanned the room, landing on Ethan, who was sitting on the couch with his toy trucks spread out in front of him. His bright eyes looked up at her as she entered, his face lighting up in a smile, and for a moment, Lena's heart ached with love and gratitude. "Mom!" Ethan exclaimed, rushing over to give her a tight hug around the waist. "Look, I made a racetrack for my trucks." Lena returned the hug, her arms wrapping around him instinctively, but a part of her was distant. As much as she loved her son, as much as she cherished him, she couldn't ignore the storm brewing inside her. He deserved a mother who was whole, who wasn't torn between two lives, two loves. She knelt down beside him, placing a kiss on the top of his head. "That's awesome, buddy," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're really good at this." But Ethan didn't seem to notice her distraction. He was already talking excitedly about his trucks and their racing adventures, completely unaware of the turmoil that was threatening to consume his mother. Lena smiled at him, her heart swelling with love, but also with an overwhelming sense of guilt. How could she make this right? How could she ensure that Ethan grew up in a world where love wasn't something torn apart by indecision? "Mom, is everything okay?" Ethan asked, his bright eyes looking up at her with concern. Lena's breath caught in her throat. He was so perceptive, always so in tune with her emotions, even when she tried to hide them. She had always tried to protect him from the darker parts of life, from the pain and heartbreak that had once defined her. But now, it seemed as though there was no escaping the reality of the choices she had to make. "I'm just thinking, sweetie," Lena said with a smile, brushing a strand of hair from his face. "Everything's fine." But Ethan wasn't convinced. He looked up at her with an intensity that felt too much for such a young boy. "You don't look fine. You look sad." Lena swallowed hard, forcing a smile to her lips. "It's just been a long day," she replied, hoping he would drop it. But she knew, deep down, that he wouldn't. Ethan had a way of getting to the heart of things, of seeing through her lies, and tonight, she couldn't keep up the facade. Before she could say anything else, the doorbell rang. Lena's heart skipped a beat. She knew who it was before she even looked through the peephole. Tom. He had arrived, and the time had come. She felt a rush of emotions flood her. Nervousness, guilt, fear, and, oddly, a sense of relief. She had been avoiding this moment for so long, but now that it was here, there was no turning back. "I'll get it," Lena said to Ethan, standing up and wiping her palms on her jeans. Ethan nodded and went back to his racetrack, his attention now fully absorbed in his game. Taking a deep breath, Lena opened the door to find Tom standing there, his posture tense, his expression unreadable. He looked as though he had been waiting for this moment for a long time. There was no trace of the easygoing man she had come to know. Instead, he was rigid, his eyes searching hers as if looking for some kind of sign, some kind of clarity. "Hey," Tom said softly, his voice carrying the weight of everything left unsaid. "Hi," Lena replied, her voice unsteady. She stepped aside to let him in, her nerves fraying at the edges. She had been preparing for this conversation in her head for days, but now that it was finally happening, she had no idea what to say. Tom stepped into the living room, glancing at Ethan before focusing back on Lena. He looked at her, as though weighing every word before speaking. "How's he doing?" Ethan was still absorbed in his game, but he glanced up momentarily, offering Tom a shy smile before returning to his trucks. Tom's face softened at the sight, and for a brief moment, Lena saw the warmth that had drawn her to him all those years ago. "He's good," Lena said, her voice thick with emotion. "He's always good, you know?" Tom nodded, taking a deep breath. "I know. He's a great kid." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their unspoken words hanging in the air like a dense fog. Lena could feel the tension building between them, could feel the distance that had crept in over the years, growing more pronounced now that the moment of truth had arrived. She finally found her voice, though it trembled as she spoke. "I've been thinking a lot, Tom, about everything. About us, and about Mac." Tom's eyes flickered with understanding, though there was no hint of surprise. He had known that this moment was coming, that Lena's feelings for Max were still there, lingering beneath the surface. But hearing her say it aloud was different. It was real. "I know," Tom said quietly. "I know this isn't easy, and I know that Max will always be a part of your life, a part of your past. But I need to know, Lena, do you still want this? Do you still want us?" Lena's heart raced as she struggled to find the words. The love she felt for Tom was undeniable, but the love she felt for Max, the ghost of that love, still lingered in her chest. How could she choose between the two of them? How could she decide which path to take when both felt equally right and wrong? I don't know," Lena whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't know if I can make a choice. I don't know if I can give you the answer you want." Tom took a step forward, his expression softening, his voice gentle. "Lena, I've always wanted what's best for you. And if that's not me, if that's not us, I'll accept that. I will. But I need you to be honest with me. I need you to tell me what you need, what you want." Lena closed her eyes, feeling the weight of his words settle in her chest. She had always admired Tom's patience, his willingness to support her, even when things were uncertain. But now, more than ever, she realized just how much of herself she had given to him, how much of her heart he had claimed. "I need time," Lena said softly, her voice filled with the quiet desperation that had been building inside her. "I just need time to figure this out." Tom didn't say anything for a moment. He simply nodded, as though he had expected this answer. "I can give you time," he said quietly, "but I won't wait forever." Lena nodded, feeling the finality in his words. She knew the stakes were high. She knew that the decision she made tonight would set the course for the rest of her life. She wasn't ready, not yet, But she had to make a choice, and it had to be soon. Chapter 14. The Weight of Unspoken Words. The days after the conversation with Tom felt like a blur. Time, once steady and predictable, now seemed to shift and stretch in unpredictable ways. Lena had spent countless hours thinking about her life, the choices she had made, the paths she had taken, and where they had led her. The weight of her indecision was almost unbearable, and yet, every time she thought she had an answer, a memory of Max, of the love they once shared, would surface, pulling her back into the past. The house felt emptier than it had in a long time. Ethan's laughter, usually the soundtrack to their lives, seemed quieter now. He was still the bright, innocent child he had always been, but even he could sense the tension in the air. There were moments when Lena caught him looking at her with concern, his wide eyes filled with a silent question she couldn't answer. She had tried to protect him from the turmoil of her heart, but the truth was, Ethan was too perceptive for her to hide anything from him. Max had reached out to her after their brief encounter at the park. It had been a tentative text at first, simple, almost casual, just a reminder of how good it had been to see her again. But over the next few days, their conversations had grown more frequent, more meaningful. There was a familiarity in his words, a warmth in his messages that pulled Lena in, despite herself. She found herself eagerly waiting for his texts, reading them over and over, feeling the pull of their old connection. It was strange, though. Part of her resisted. Part of her wanted to put the past behind her, to keep the life she had built with Tom and Ethan intact. Tom was steady, dependable, and loving. He had never once made her feel like she had to choose between him and anything else. But there was a part of her that wondered if she had sacrificed too much to build that life. Had she forgotten pieces of herself along the way? Had she given up too easily on the love she had once shared with Max? The quiet tension in the house had become unbearable by the weekend. Lena had agreed to spend the day at a local park with Ethan, trying to make the most of the time they had together. But even as she watched her son run around, laughing and playing, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. She had been trying to focus on the present, on the joy that Ethan brought her, but her mind kept drifting to Max, to the life they had once dreamed of building together. "Mom, can we go on the swings?" Ethan called out, his voice full of excitement. Lena smiled, trying to push her thoughts aside. "Of course, sweetie," she said, her voice soft. They made their way to the swings, and for a moment, as she pushed Ethan higher and higher, Lena let herself be lost in the simple joy of the moment. The sun was warm on her face, and the sound of Ethan's laughter filled the air, a balm for the ache in her chest. She could almost convince herself that everything was fine, that there was nothing to worry about, nothing to choose between. But then, just as she was about to push Ethan higher again, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She hesitated for a moment before pulling it out, her fingers trembling as she unlocked the screen. It was a message from Max. "I've been thinking about you a lot lately. I know this is complicated, but I miss you, Lena. I can't help it." Lena's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected this, hadn't expected Max to be so open, so vulnerable. His words stirred something deep within her, something she had tried so hard to bury. The love they had shared was still there, still burning beneath the surface. She had told herself that it was in the past, that she had moved on, but the truth was, she hadn't. She hadn't moved on at all. Ethan's voice broke through her thoughts, pulling her back to the present. "Mom, are you okay?" Lena looked down at her son, who was now staring up at her with wide, worried eyes. She smiled, trying to hide the storm brewing inside her. "I'm fine, sweetie. Just a little tired." But Ethan wasn't convinced. He reached up and tugged at her sleeve. "You're not fine, Mom. You're sad again." Lena's heart ached at the tenderness in his voice. She knelt down beside him, placing a hand on his small shoulder. "I'm okay, really. Just thinking about some things." "About Max?" Ethan asked, his voice small, as though he had already figured it out. Lena froze. She hadn't realized how much her son had noticed, how much he had understood. But Ethan was perceptive, and she couldn't hide from him, not even now. "Sweetheart, it's complicated," she said gently. "Max is a part of my past, but that's all he is now. I need to focus on you and everything we have right here." Ethan looked at her for a long moment, his small brow furrowed in thought. Finally, he nodded, though there was a sadness in his eyes that made Lena feel like she was letting him down. "I don't want you to be sad anymore, Mom," he said softly. "I want you to be happy." Lena swallowed hard, blinking back tears. "I know, baby. I want that too. I'll figure it out, okay?" Ethan smiled, but it was a smile tinged with concern, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Lena knew that he understood more than she was letting on, more than she was ready to admit. Later that afternoon, after they had returned home, Lena found herself standing in front of the mirror, staring at her reflection. She looked tired, worn out, her eyes haunted by the weight of the decision she knew she had to make. She had tried to bury the past, to convince herself that her life with Tom was enough. But now, the truth was inescapable. She had never truly let go of Max. Lena's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the front door opening. She turned to see Tom standing there, his face tired but smiling, as though he had just returned from a long day at work. "Hey," he said, his voice warm. "How was the park?" "It was good," Lena said, forcing a smile. "Ethan had a great time." Tom nodded, setting down his briefcase and walking over to her. "You look like you've had a long day too." Lena hesitated, unsure of how to respond. She felt a pang of guilt, a weight pressing down on her chest. She knew that Tom was the steady, reliable one, the one who had always been there for her, who had never wavered in his support. But Max was the one who had awakened something deep within her, something she thought was long gone. "I'm okay," Lena said, though the words felt hollow. Tom reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch warm and reassuring. "You don't have to pretend, Lena. I know something's been weighing on you. You don't have to carry it alone." Lena's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to tell him everything, wanted to explain how torn she felt, how she was caught between two lives, two loves. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, she simply nodded, her heart heavy with the realization that no matter what she chose, someone would be hurt. And that hurt, she knew, was a price she would have to pay. Chapter 15. Between Duty and Desire. The days that followed were a delicate dance of emotions, a constant balancing act between the life Lena had built with Tom and the magnetic pull of the past she shared with Max. Every day, as she went through the motions of her routine, she felt the weight of an unspoken question hanging in the air. What would it take for her to choose? What was it that she truly wanted? Each morning, she woke up to find herself caught between two worlds. The gentle hum of life with Tom, with Ethan, was a comforting routine. She had everything she had ever dreamed of: a loving husband, a sweet, funny son, a home filled with laughter. But then, in the quiet moments when the noise of everyday life faded away, memories of Max would flood her mind. The warmth of his embrace, the tenderness of his touch, the feeling of being understood in a way she had never experienced with anyone else. Her heart ached. She had promised herself, after everything that had happened, that she would never go back to that place, never allow herself to be pulled back into the whirlwind of emotions Max had once stirred in her. And yet, here she was again, standing on the edge of that precipice, unable to look away. Tom, ever perceptive, could tell that something was different. He had tried to talk to Lena about it, but she had brushed him off, convinced that the problem was hers to solve alone. She had always been the one to shoulder the weight of her emotions, the one to keep everything balanced, even when she felt like she was drowning beneath it all. One evening, after a particularly long day, Tom had come home early from work. He found Lena sitting in the living room, staring out the window, her gaze distant. She hadn't noticed him standing there, watching her, until he cleared his throat softly. She turned, her face a mixture of exhaustion and guilt. "Hey," Tom said gently, walking over to sit beside her on the couch. "We need to talk." Lena's heart skipped a beat. She knew what was coming. She had seen the way he looked at her lately, the way his eyes lingered with concern, and she had heard the quiet tension in his voice when they spoke. He knew something was off. She couldn't keep pretending anymore. "I know," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm sorry, Tom." Tom took her hand, his touch warm and reassuring, but there was a quiet sadness in his eyes. "Lena, whatever this is between us, it's not like it used to be. I can feel the distance. I can see it in your eyes. You're not here with me, not really." Lena swallowed hard, the lump in her throat making it difficult to speak. She had wanted to tell him everything, wanted to explain how torn she was, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she nodded, her gaze dropping to their entwined hands. "I don't know what's happening anymore, Tom. I've been lost in my own head, and I don't know how to find my way back." Tom's expression softened, but the pain in his voice was clear. "Lena, we've been through so much together, but if something is missing, something you can't get back, then maybe it's time we face that." Her heart clenched at the thought. She couldn't imagine a life without Tom, without Ethan, but the truth was, she couldn't imagine a life without Max either. The very fact that she was still harboring feelings for her ex, feelings that had never truly gone away, made her question everything. She had tried so hard to push them aside, to bury the past, but she couldn't ignore it any longer. It was alive inside of her, and it was slowly tearing her apart. "I don't want to hurt you, Tom," she said, her voice breaking. "You've been nothing but good to me. You deserve someone who can give you all of herself, and I don't know if I can be that person anymore." Tom was quiet for a long moment, processing her words. Then, slowly, he spoke. "I love you, Lena. You know that. But I can't keep holding on to something if you're not all in. I won't hold you back, not when you're so clearly torn." Lena felt the tears well up in her eyes. She had never wanted to hurt Tom. He had been her rock, the one constant in her life. But in her heart, she knew that she couldn't keep living this lie. Something had to give. "I don't know what to do," Lena whispered, the weight of the decision bearing down on her. Tom kissed her forehead, his lips soft against her skin. "Take the time you need, Lena. I want you to be happy, even if that means you have to make a choice that's hard for both of us." Lena's heart shattered at his words. She had never wanted to be the one to tear apart the life they had built together. But as she sat there, staring at the love of her life, she realized that the choice wasn't really about Tom or Max. It was about her, about who she had become in the years since everything had fallen apart with Max, and whether she could truly move forward, or if she was always going to be haunted by the ghosts of her past. The days that followed were filled with quiet contemplation. Lena took long walks, trying to clear her head, trying to find the answer she so desperately sought. Her mind was a battleground, torn between the love she had with Tom, the life they had built, and the passion that still simmered between her and Max. Every time she thought she had made a decision, every time she told herself that it was time to move on, something would pull her back, like a string tethering her to a past she couldn't escape. And then, one evening, just as the sun was beginning to set, she found herself standing outside her front door, staring down at her phone. Max's name was displayed on the screen, his message blinking back at her in the dimming light. I miss you. I know this is all a mess, but I can't help how I feel. Can we talk? Lena's breath caught in her throat. She had been avoiding Max, telling herself that it was better this way. But here he was again, reaching out, his words pulling her in. She stared at the message for what felt like an eternity, the weight of her decision pressing down on her chest. She had to make a choice. She had to confront the truth of her heart, no matter how painful it might be. With trembling hands, she typed a response. I don't know what to say, Max. I'm so lost right now. She hit send and waited. The seconds felt like hours. Finally, his response appeared. I don't have the answers, Lena, but I need you to know that I've never stopped loving you. And in that moment, as the last of the sunlight faded from the sky, Lena knew that she was at the tipping point. The choice she had been avoiding for so long was no longer something she could run from. She had to face it, to face herself, and whatever came next, she would have to live with the consequences. But for the first time in a long time, Lena finally felt alive, her heart beating with the raw, undeniable truth of the love she had never fully let go of. Chapter 16. A choice written in tears. Lena didn't sleep that night. The words that had passed between her and Max echoed in her mind, their weight pressing down on her chest. Her phone sat on the bedside table, still lit with the faint glow of Max's last message. She had hoped that after reading it, she would feel some kind of clarity, but instead, she felt more confused than ever. Her heart, once certain in its love for Tom, now wavered in the face of Max's unwavering affection. The quiet of the house was deafening. Tom was asleep in the next room, completely unaware of the turmoil that was consuming her. She could hear the rhythmic sound of his breathing, steady and calm, a stark contrast to the chaos inside her. Lena sat up in bed, wrapping her arms around her knees. She stared out the window, watching as the first light of dawn slowly began to break through the darkness. It was a beautiful morning, but to Lena, it felt like the beginning of something irreversible. The past and present were colliding, and she had no idea which direction to turn. The truth was, she had never really let go of Max. No matter how much she had tried to convince herself that her marriage with Tom was everything she needed, the part of her that had once belonged to Max had never fully been hers to claim again. That love, raw, intense, and all-encompassing, had left an imprint on her heart that nothing could erase. And now, faced with the reality of his return, it was impossible to ignore the powerful pull he still had on her. She could feel the familiar ache in her chest as she thought of Max. His voice, the way he had held her, the way he understood her in ways that Tom never had. But then, she thought of Tom. His steady love, the way he had been there for her, even when she couldn't be fully present. The years they had spent together, raising Ethan, building a life. How could she throw all of that away for a love that had already broken her once? Lena's thoughts were a storm, and the longer she sat there, the more overwhelmed she felt. The decisions she had to make were no longer just about love. They were about who she was, what kind of life she wanted, and whether she could ever truly be free of the past that still held her captive. But no matter how many times she tried to reason with herself, there was one undeniable truth. She was still in love with Max. She got out of bed quietly, not wanting to disturb Tom, and grabbed her phone. She scrolled through their past conversations, trying to find some clue that could lead her to an answer. But each message, each word, only reminded her of the love they had shared, of the promises they had made to one another, promises that had been broken by the weight of betrayal. Lena could feel her hands tremble as she tapped on Max's name again. There was no turning back now. The choice she had been avoiding was right in front of her, and for the first time, she allowed herself to give in to the emotions she had been suppressing for so long. I need to see you, she typed. I'm not sure what I'm doing, but I need to talk. Her finger hovered over the send button for a moment, and then she pressed it. The message was out there now, hanging in the air between them. She didn't know what would come of it, but she couldn't keep living in this limbo. She needed closure, one way or another. Max's reply came almost immediately. I'll be there in an hour. It was as if he had been waiting for this moment, too. His words were a lifeline, pulling her towards something she couldn't escape, no matter how hard she tried. Lena stood up and walked to the bathroom, splashing cold water on her face. She stared at her reflection, barely recognizing the woman staring back at her. This was the woman who had made mistakes, who had lost herself in the pursuit of a perfect life, only to discover that perfection had a price. What did she truly want? What kind of love did she deserve? She changed into a simple outfit, nothing fancy, just something comfortable that would allow her to breathe. When she looked at herself in the mirror again, she didn't see the broken woman she had been so afraid of becoming. Instead, she saw someone who was finally taking control of her own destiny. The knock at the door came too soon, pulling Lena from her thoughts. Her heart raced, her breath shallow. She stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do. But then, as if on instinct, she walked toward the door and opened it. Max stood there, his expression soft, but his eyes full of longing. His presence filled the doorway, and for a moment, Lena was transported back to the days before everything had fallen apart. He was the same man, the man she had loved with all her heart, but she was not the same woman. "Lena," he said softly, his voice hoarse with emotion. Lena swallowed hard. She wanted to say so many things, but she couldn't find the words. She stepped aside, allowing him to enter. The moment he crossed the threshold, the air between them seemed to shift, charged with an energy neither of them could deny. They stood there for a long time, simply looking at each other, as if trying to read the answers in each other's eyes. The silence was heavy, but it was the kind of silence that spoke volumes. Finally, Max spoke. "I've missed you, Lena, more than you can imagine. I never stopped thinking about you. Not for a single day." Her heart ached at his words. The pain of their past betrayal surged within her, but so did the love, the deep, unshakable connection that had once bound them together. "I never stopped thinking about you either," Lena whispered, her voice breaking. "But Max, I can't undo what happened. I can't go back to the way things were. Not without hurting so many people." Max's eyes were filled with regret, but there was also a determination there, an undeniable resolve. "I don't expect you to erase the past. I just want a chance, Lena. A chance to show you that I've changed, that I'm still the man you loved." Tears welled up in her eyes as she looked at him, torn between the love she still felt for him and the life she had built with Tom and Ethan. She didn't have the answers yet, but for the first time, she felt the weight of the truth lifting from her shoulders. She was no longer running from it. She was standing face to face with the hardest decision of her life. Max stepped closer, his hand reaching out for hers, and Lena let him take it. The connection was instant, as if no time had passed at all, and for a brief moment, she allowed herself to believe in the possibility of a future with him. But the road ahead was uncertain. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, or if this was a mistake she would regret. All she knew was that her heart was finally awake, and for the first time in a long time, she was ready to face whatever came next. Whether that was with Max, with Tom, or on her own, she had come this far, and now it was time to find her true north, no matter where it led. Chapter 17. Lovers in a World That Forgot Us. Lena stood by the window, watching as the evening sky turned a deep shade of violet. The sun had long since set, leaving behind a quiet that seemed almost too still, too heavy. She hadn't moved from her spot since Max had left hours ago. The words they had shared still lingered in the air, and the pull between them was stronger than anything she had ever experienced. Yet, she knew something had shifted within her, something deeper than just the love that had once tied them together. Max had come, and in the space of a few minutes, he had reminded her of the person she had once been. The woman who had loved fiercely, without hesitation, without fear of what tomorrow might bring. But that woman, the one who had given herself to Max without reservation, was no longer who she was. She had grown, not just in age, but in wisdom, in resilience. She had learned what it meant to sacrifice, to love with quiet patience, to build something lasting even when the odds were stacked against her. Now, standing at the precipice of yet another decision, she felt as though she were facing the ocean. The waves crashed against the shore, each one a possibility, each one carrying the weight of her past, her present, and her future. She could feel the pull of the tide, urging her to let go, to be swept away by the current of what could be. But she also knew that the ocean was vast and unpredictable, and it was not a place to go without a sense of direction. Lena's mind was a whirlwind, every thought tangled and conflicting. On one hand, there was Max, still the same, still the man who had made her heart race, who had shown her a love so all-consuming that it had almost broken her. And on the other hand, there was Tom, the man who had been there for her through the darkest days, the one who had stood by her side when the world seemed to crumble around them, the man who had helped her pick up the pieces of her life, even when she didn't know how to help herself. The thought of Tom sent a pang through her chest. He had been her anchor, her constant in a world full of change. He had given her a family, a home, and a life that was simple, steady, and filled with love. And Ethan, her precious son, the thought of tearing their family apart, of disrupting the life they had built, felt like a betrayal. Could she really risk everything for a love that had already left her heartbroken once? But then there was Max's voice, echoing in her mind. He had said he had changed, that he was no longer the man who had hurt her all those years ago. He had begged for a chance to prove himself, to show her that he was worthy of her love once again. Lena closed her eyes, trying to steady her breath. The decision before her felt impossible. She could feel the weight of both paths, each one leading her into an unknown future. The past was calling her, with its memories of passion and loss, and the present was pulling her back with its promise of stability and love. She was standing at the crossroads, but the signposts were obscured by the fog of uncertainty. She walked to the kitchen, her feet moving automatically as her mind continued to race. Tom had been working late again, and the house was eerily quiet. She picked up a mug from the counter, absently stirring her coffee as she stared out the window. The streets below bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. She had always found comfort in the quiet moments, but tonight, it felt suffocating. The silence only amplified her thoughts, her doubts. The doorbell rang, pulling Lena from her reverie. She set the mug down, her heart skipping a beat. She wasn't expecting anyone. Her pulse quickened, and she found herself hesitating. She knew who it was before she even reached the door. When she opened it, Max was standing there again, this time with no hesitation in his eyes. He had come back, and there was something different about him now. He wasn't the reckless young man she had once loved. No, this Max was older, quieter, as though the years apart had shaped him into someone who understood the weight of what he was asking. "I couldn't leave it like that," Max said, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "I couldn't just walk away without making sure you knew the truth, without making sure you knew that I'm not the man I was. I'm not asking you to forget what happened, Lena. I'm asking for the chance to start over, for both of us to start over." Lena's heart trembled, torn between the pull of his words and the reality of her life. She had dreamed of this moment for so long, of Max coming back, of having a second chance at the love they had once shared. But now that it was here, It felt like a dream she couldn't quite hold on to. "I don't know what to do, Max," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I've spent so long trying to move on, trying to build something that's strong and lasting. And now you're here, asking me to tear everything down and start again. I can't make that decision, not without hurting so many people." "Tom, Ethan." Max's expression softened. "I know," he said quietly. "I know the stakes, and I'm not asking you to throw it all away. I just want you to know that I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. And if you decide that it's worth the risk, that we're worth the risk, then I'll be here waiting." Tears welled up in Lena's eyes, and she stepped back, wrapping her arms around herself as if to hold herself together. The weight of his words, the truth in them, was almost too much to bear. Max had never been good at asking for things, never good at being vulnerable. But now, he was offering her something she couldn't ignore. A chance to love him again, to rebuild what they had lost. But the reality was that Lena's heart wasn't just hers to follow anymore. She had built a life with Tom. She had built a life for Ethan. And while the love she had once shared with Max had been a force of nature, it wasn't the only love she had. She had to consider everything. Her marriage, her son, her future. "I don't know if I can do this," she said softly. "I don't know if I can choose." Max stepped closer, his hand reaching out to her. "I'm not asking you to choose today, Lena. I'm asking you to consider it, to take the time you need. But know this, I'm here. And no matter what, I always will be." For a long moment, they stood there, the unspoken words between them heavier than anything they had ever said aloud. And in that moment, Lena realized that the tides of her life had shifted. The waves were still crashing against the shore, each one a reminder of the love she had lost and the love she could still find. The path before her was unclear, but she knew that whatever decision she made, it would be the one that led her toward the person she was meant to become. And for the first time in a long time, Lena allowed herself to believe that whatever came next, she would be ready, no matter where it took her. Chapter 18. The ending we never saw coming. The morning sun filtered softly through the curtains, casting a golden glow over the room. Lena stirred, her eyelids fluttering open as she breathed in the scent of fresh coffee that filled the air. The house was quiet, except for the low hum of the world outside. A world that, in some strange way, felt distant now. In the stillness, she felt the weight of the past few days pressing on her chest, a mixture of anticipation and fear that had refused to let go. She had spent hours the night before, sitting by the window, reflecting on everything: the life she had with Tom, the love she had shared with Max, and the choice that now lay before her. In the silence of her thoughts, she had come to realize that no matter how much time had passed, some feelings never really left. They lingered, waiting for the right moment to resurface. But even more, she had understood that love wasn't just about the past. It was about the present, the choices she made each day, and the future she wanted to build. Lena stood and walked toward the kitchen, where Tom was already preparing breakfast. His back was to her as he hummed a soft tune, the familiar rhythm of his movements comforting. This was the man she had chosen, the man who had stood by her through everything. Tom had been her rock, steady and unwavering, and the thought of losing him made her heart ache in a way she hadn't anticipated. But there was something else in her heart now, a flutter of something new, something unexpected, a spark that had been reignited in the presence of Max. Tom turned as he heard her footsteps, and his face lit up with a warm smile. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Morning, beautiful," he said softly, his eyes full of affection. "Morning," Lena replied, her voice quiet. She couldn't bring herself to tell him everything yet. She wasn't sure if she was ready to say the words that had been weighing on her for so long. The truth was, she didn't know what she was ready for. She only knew that the decisions she had to make weren't just hers anymore. They belonged to everyone involved. Tom reached for her hand, his touch grounding her. "How did you sleep?" Lena hesitated for a moment, her fingers tracing the edge of her coffee cup. She could feel the weight of the conversation hanging between them, but she couldn't bring herself to start it just yet. "I slept okay," she finally said. "I've been thinking." Tom's eyes softened, and he stepped closer, as if sensing the undercurrent of her words. "About what?" Lena swallowed hard, trying to find the right words. "About everything. About us. About what comes next." Tom studied her for a long moment, and she saw the quiet understanding in his eyes. He had always been intuitive, always able to sense when something was wrong. But this was different. This wasn't something she could easily explain. "Lena," he said, his voice tender but firm, "you don't have to say it. I know there's something weighing on you, but no matter what happens, we'll figure it out. Together." She squeezed his hand, the knot in her chest tightening. "I don't want to hurt you, Tom. I don't want to hurt anyone." He smiled, but there was a hint of sadness in his gaze. "You're not hurting me by being honest with yourself, Lena. I'd rather you tell me what's going on than keep it inside. You deserve to be happy. We both do." Lena's heart swelled with love for him, but there was a part of her that felt as though she were holding back, as though something had shifted within her in ways she couldn't fully explain. "I don't know if I'm ready to let go of the past," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know if I can choose between the life we've built and what might have been." Tom nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I understand, but just know that whatever happens, I want you to be happy. I want you to make the choice that feels right for you, even if it's not what I want." Lena's chest tightened with emotion. The love and understanding in his eyes made her feel both grateful and guilty. How could she choose between them? How could she reconcile the love she had with Tom and the love she still felt for Max? She couldn't answer that question, not yet. But what she knew was that she couldn't keep running from it. She had to face it. After breakfast, Lena went for a walk. She needed the space, the clarity. The early morning air was crisp, and the sound of the birds in the trees helped to clear her mind, even if only for a moment. She walked slowly, her mind spinning, but the peace of the moment was calming. It was in this silence that the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. She realized something profound. Love wasn't just about the emotion she felt. It was about the life she wanted to build, the future she wanted to create. It was about choosing what would bring her peace, what would allow her to grow, and what would allow her to heal. And as she walked along the path, a strange sense of calm washed over her. She didn't have to choose between the past and the present. She didn't have to choose between Max and Tom. What mattered was that she had the strength to choose what was best for her own happiness and fulfillment. By the time she returned home, she felt clearer, more certain of what she needed to do. There were no easy answers, no quick fixes, but there was a quiet strength inside her now. A strength that told her that whatever happened, she would be okay. That evening, as the sky darkened and the stars began to appear, Lena sat with Tom and Ethan on the porch. The three of them were wrapped in blankets, enjoying the cool evening breeze. It was peaceful, simple, a family. She smiled at Tom, then at Ethan, her heart full. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she was where she needed to be. And though there were still questions, still the shadow of the past lingering, Lena knew one thing for sure. The butterfly effect had led her here, to this moment. She had come full circle, and in this space, she was beginning to understand that the choices we make, no matter how small or large, ripple through time, shaping us, guiding us, and ultimately leading us to where we are meant to be. As the night settled around them, Lena felt a quiet peace. She was home,